Think for a moment about your favorite epic journey story. The great literatures of the world are filled with epic journey stories, right? There is the Odyssey, written by the Greek poet Homer more than 2,500 years ago. The story of the hero Odysseus trying to get home to his wife Penelope after the Trojan War. There is The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, the story of Frodo Baggins trying to get to Mordor to destroy Sauron's ring. There is The Incredible Journey by Sheila Burnford, a book I dearly loved as a child, a story of two dogs and a cat trying to get home across wild Canadian wilderness to the family they love. I am guessing that your favorite epic journey story is coming to mind. Now, think of the story of two travelers going to Emmaus on the afternoon of the day of Jesus' resurrection. This story does not have any of the classic markers of an epic journey saga. No lurking dangers, no malevolent enemies, no battles or betrayals. The synopsis of this journey is two travelers, a husband and a wife perhaps, walking on the road from Jerusalem. They are walking home, a hike of about 7 miles. This does not have the makings of a literary classic or a blockbuster movie or a favorite children's book. But let's look again. This may actually be an epic journey story. The contours of this story, again, I'm impressed by this fact. On the afternoon of the morning of Jesus' resurrection, the contours are fairly ordinary. This is the story of a long walk with a meal. But friends, it is the outcome of that long walk with a meal that makes this epic. This is high drama. How is it that two ordinary travelers can begin their walk in deep disappointment and despair and end in a 180-degree turn toward boldness and belief? How is it that this can happen without the trappings of epic journey stories? Trappings, say, like an angelic choir on a hillside, or regal visitors from the east, or tongues of fire, or water transformed into wine, those kinds of epic journey things. How is it that this can happen without those things? As we look carefully at Luke 24, we realize that the dramatic turnaround of this story sneaks up on you. It's practically disguised because it is embedded in the ordinary. The faith that so unexpectedly blossoms is, I suggest, a dusty faith, because it is narrated in the to and fro, the comings and goings, the conversations and silences, all ordinary moments in a most extraordinary day. Faith peeks out, then emerges a bit, and then eventually takes flight. But this day reveals its Easter power in ordinary interactions. Flannery O'Connor once remarked that God's revelation is sometimes like God darting from tree to tree, like the pair of cardinals that nest outside my kitchen window in the spring, the blazing red male and the ashy brick female. God reveals and works, but often cloaked in daily, humble, ordinary things. Sure, sometimes God reveals in dramatic encounters. The story of Jacob wrestling with the angel in Genesis 32 bristles with mystery and danger. Jacob, wounded at dawn after a night's struggle, says in weariness, "I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." This is the stuff of epic drama. I want to suggest, though, that this journey of Cleopas and his companion is epic and grand as well. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. Here is the remarkable pivot that ushered in through very ordinary events. Little micro events, really. The time and space of a 7-mile walk, a lengthy conversation with the risen Jesus, who they thought was a stranger, a shared meal, a prayer of blessing. When Jesus fell in step with them on the road, these two disciples did not recognize him because their assumptions ruled out the possibility that it could be Jesus. So, Jesus took them right where they were and talked to them. He first listened to them, explaining then how the Hebrew Scriptures were filled with messianic hope and expectation. Our text implies that this might have taken some time. Verse 27 says that Jesus began with Moses and went through the prophets. The journey toward that pivot point for these disciples to see and understand required the care and patience of Jesus. Gradually, these disciples started to build a new framework in order to see. Later on in the story, do you remember? Later on, they looked back and were able to pinpoint the beginning of their seeing. Ah, yes. Remember how our hearts were burning within us when he was talking to us on the road? They slowly built a new framework. Later on in the story, do you remember? We read, "In their joy, they were disbelieving." This all took a little time to sink in. The miracles began to unfold even before they fully knew it. Small, ordinary things tipped over into recognition, faith, action. This is a journey story that rises to the level of epic. In the early 1600s, the Italian painter Caravaggio painted several wonderful depictions of the Emmaus story. They always focus on the exact moment when these two Emmaus travelers recognized the risen Jesus as their Lord. In my favorite painting, Jesus is at a table with his two friends, sharing with them their simple supper. Jesus had just taken the bread and blessed it. Suddenly, the two friends saw what they could not see until that moment, and their astonishment leaps off of the canvas. One friend throws out both arms and hands. The other is caught mid-leap out of his chair. Here is the moment of faith. Here is the pivot point. Here is the high drama of the story. There is a lot of theology in this Caravaggio painting. There is some humor as well. A servant stands there, right by Jesus' shoulder. He stands with a water jug in his hand and looks dubious, doubtful, even a bit dour. The moment of revelation misses him completely. He just wants to clear up the supper dishes. The theology of this painting is that Jesus is revealed in the breaking of the bread. That is the dramatic turn of the story. But Jesus is also revealed slowly and in retrospect through the conversation and the care given on the dusty road. For many of us here this morning, not all of us, but many of us, this is how faith develops and grows. Faith walks along a dusty road and listens, discusses, grows, matures. For the Emmaus disciples, fear turned to trust, doubt turned to joy, disbelief turned to recognition, grief turned to witness. But I invite you to notice that all of these transformations have their own dusty history. Fred Craddock of blessed memory, a preacher of wit and warmth, tells the story of his sincere childhood longing to give his life to Jesus. He wanted his faith to be big and dramatic, something that would require courage and selfless heroism. But his childhood was safe, healthy, and whole. He was frustrated that giving his life to Jesus seemed a possibility far outside the fence line of his backyard. 50 years later, Craddock understood that following Jesus in his life was like, well, it was like a dusty journey. He said, "Nobody warned me that I could not write one big check. I've had to write 50 years of little checks, 87 cents, 21 cents, 54 cents. What he expressed is what so many of us experience. Faith has its own unfolding story, sometimes dramatic, sometimes ordinary, sometimes individual, sometimes in community, but all of it is accompanied by the risen Christ who teaches, encourages, corrects, nourishes, and reveals. Friends, I am here today to say, borrowing from and adapting an old gospel song, that Jesus walks with us and talks with us and tells us that we belong to him. This is the good news, and it makes for an epic journey story of God's persistent love, patient grace, and tender mercies. Believe this good news, live in its peace, and walk your own dusty road of faith. Amen.